In the final, shattering months of World War II, the eastern horizon of Europe no longer burned with the promise of victory, but with the slow and terrifying realization of defeat. Villages once occupied by German forces now stood in ruins behind them, as the Red Army advanced in relentless waves. The Eastern Front, once the pride of military command, was dissolving into retreat, fragmentation, and silence where orders used to echo. Among those caught in the collapse were not only infantrymen and artillery crews, but thousands of German women, nurses, radio operators, clerks, medics, translators, and auxiliaries attached to supply units. They had joined, many of them still barely out of school, convinced they were contributing to something far larger than themselves. What they were never prepared for was what happened when that something crumbled. As the Soviets advanced, roads filled with columns of the displaced, soldiers without command, civilians fleeing the fighting, and women in uniform trying to stay with their units, or simply survive. The front was no longer a line. It was a flood. And in that flood, hierarchy dissolved, logistics dissolved, the promise of protection dissolved. Rumors swept through the ranks long before the soldiers of the East ever saw the enemy face to face. Tales of what awaited captured women, whispered in the cold of night, passed between bunk beds and makeshift shelters, were sometimes exaggerated, sometimes heartbreakingly real. For many, the fear of capture became worse than the fear of dying in battle. In field hospitals hastily abandoned, nurses packed bandages, iodine, and field rations more out of instinct than hope. Radio operators tore down equipment as artillery thundered in the distance. Clerks burned documents until the smoke itself tasted like closing history. They were not trained for flight. They were trained for order, but the war around them no longer obeyed any rule of order. Along the retreat paths, uniforms became both shield and target. For some, the badge on the shoulder still meant status. For others, it meant they would never again be seen simply as human, only as the symbol of an enemy collapsing in defeat. Their names, their origins, their families, all risked being erased by the uniform they wore. The final retreat was not marked by a single battle, nor a single surrender, but by a slow draining of hope. Convoys broke apart. Communications failed. Officers disappeared. For every kilometer traveled westward, the lines behind them fell deeper into chaos. By late winter, capture was no longer a distant possibility. It was an inevitability. Entire columns of German troops surrendered without firing a shot, not out of cowardice, but exhaustion. Some soldiers were grateful to lay down their weapons. The women had no such relief. They carried neither rifles nor the illusion of equal treatment. For them, surrender did not promise safety, only uncertainty. When the first camps appeared on the horizon, hidden behind barbed wire and watchtowers, there was no ceremony of fate, no final orders, no official transition from soldier to prisoner. A gate opened, a gate closed, and everything they once were, every role, every rank, every belief, began silently slipping away. They were no longer auxiliaries or medical personnel or communications officers. They were prisoners, and in captivity. The first thing taken is not one's freedom, but one's dignity. This is where their true ordeal began, not in the roar of artillery, not in the thunder of the front, but in the silence that followed defeat. The first days of captivity did not begin with shelter or structure. They began with a march, long, directionless, and unspoken. The women were gathered into makeshift columns and pushed forward, step by step, across frozen fields and ruined villages. There were no explanations of where they were being taken, no mention of how far they would walk. Only the command to move, the sound of retreating boots and shuffling feet blended with the wind. A wind heavy with smoke, thawing earth, and the residue of war. What had once been military roads were now graveyard paths, burned-out vehicles, abandoned equipment, shattered farmhouses, and the lingering silence of places already emptied of the living. Some of the women still clung to their training. Straight posture, disciplined silence, the instinct to keep formation. Others staggered, weakened by days without proper food or sleep. A few tried to count the distance by the sun, or by the hours between guard rotations. But time itself had become unreliable. When survival becomes the only task, minutes and miles begin to feel interchangeable. Water was scarce. Food scarcer still. Many survived on snow gathered from roadside ditches or crusts of stale bread scavenged from supply ruins. The guards rarely spoke to them, except to issue brief cold orders in gestures or single-word commands. The women did not yet know which guards were hardened veterans, and which were barely older than the prisoners themselves, only that the watchful eyes behind them never rested. Along the road, they passed columns of displaced civilians, mothers clutching infants wrapped in threadbare blankets, elderly men walking with the vacant stare of someone who has buried too much to cry anymore, children too tired to whimper. In that moment, uniform or not, captor or captive, all were pieces of a continent breaking apart under the weight of its own war. But the women knew they were watched differently. Civilians received pity. The women received scrutiny. They were not mere victims of circumstance. They were symbols of a defeated regime, vessels of blame in human form. And in war, symbols are never treated gently. At night they slept wherever the march halted. Barns without roofs, half-destroyed churches, fields hardened by frost. There were no blankets, no beds, and no privacy. The first fractures of dignity appeared not in violence but in exhaustion, wearing the same clothes for days, unable to wash, unable to rest without collapsing into the soil itself. Fear became a second skin. Silent questions circled through every mind. How far will they take us? Will we ever see home again? What will happen when the gates close? Some tried to comfort one another, linking arms when the march threatened to pull them apart. But others withdrew into themselves, learning what captivity teaches before any command is issued. Survival is not only physical, it is psychological, and it begins by guarding whatever remains of one's inner world. On the 11th day of marching, a distant silhouette appeared beyond a broken tree line. Barbed wire, guard towers and barracks rising from muddy earth. The structure was neither fortress nor shelter. It was a statement. A message without words. You have crossed the threshold. There would be no turning back. The prisoners did not cheer, though their legs trembled from exhaustion. The sight of the camp did not look like an end to hardship, but a doorway into a new kind of uncertainty. Here the march would stop, but the ordeal would truly begin. Some of them prayed in silence. Others stared forward, hollow-eyed. No one spoke aloud the truth each of them felt. This was not imprisonment of the body alone. It was the beginning of captivity of the soul. The gates did not slam shut with drama. They closed with the dull, final sound of metal on metal, the sound of a world ending quietly. As the column of women entered the compound, the guards gave no welcome, no instructions of comfort, not even a moment to breathe. Instead, they were ordered to line up in rows, shoulder to shoulder, facing a low administrative building near the center of the camp. For a brief moment, some believed the inspection would be routine. A roll call, the taking of names, perhaps a medical check for lice or infection. Many had endured such procedures before while still in uniform, but there was a difference between discipline inside an army and discipline under captivity. It was not the task itself that wounded. It was the manner in which it was demanded. The first sign came not in words but in gestures, boots tapping the ground, guards shifting position, a curt nod toward the building. The women were divided into smaller groups and led toward an interior processing room. No explanation, no translator, only the growing sense that something would be taken from them that no uniform could ever protect. Inside the building, the space was cold and dim. Lanterns cast uneven shadows across the walls. Medical tables stood along the back, stripped bare except for notebooks and rubber gloves. A sour odor lingered, disinfectant, sweat, and the ghost of prior inspections. At first glance, it resembled a clinic. To those about to pass through it, it felt more like a threshold. Only when the first commands were issued did the truth become clear. They were to remove their clothing, not for punishment, not as torture, but as procedure. A neutral word for a degrading act, carried out without compassion, without privacy, and without choice. The announcement did not come in shouts. It came in a flat, administrative tone, as if clothing were merely another possession to be catalogued. But the reaction was not administrative. The air itself seemed to contract. Shoulders stiffened, hands gripped sleeves, heartbeats climbed into throats. The body reacts to humiliation long before the mind can form protest. Some women obeyed immediately, not from willingness but from shock, fatigue, and the instinct to survive any command that promised an end to waiting. Others froze where they stood, as if the ground had turned to stone beneath them. A few whispered prayers, one or two quietly wept, not loud enough to cry, but enough to show that fear can silence a voice more effectively than chains. For the guards, it was a checkpoint. For the women, it was the first fracture of the self. Stripped clothing meant stripped identity, a boundary crossed from soldier to captive, from dignified being to processed body. What had once been a uniform was now an accusation, and what had once been autonomy was now a question of compliance. As each name, or number, was called forward, eyes turned away instinctively, not out of shame alone, but solidarity. No one wanted to witness what they themselves would soon endure. And yet, there was no shielding one another from the moment. You cannot look away from the breaking of dignity when you are standing in line to lose your own. Those who complied were processed quickly, but their faces showed the cost. They walked out wrapped in thin camp garments, pale and shaken, not cold, but altered. No one spoke as they emerged, because each of them carried the same unspoken message. It has begun. Those who hesitated were pulled aside. A new line formed, smaller, slower, heavier with fear. These were women who clung not to rank or uniform, but to the last piece of themselves that captivity had not yet claimed. It was not rebellion. It was instinct, the final defense of dignity. Outside, the winter wind scraped across the yard like a second interrogation. The column of unprocessed women waited, not for escape, but for courage that might never come. The first inspection was not about illness. It was not about hygiene. It was a test of ownership, a quiet declaration that from this moment onward, their bodies, their silence, and their humiliation belonged to someone else. The camp had not yet touched them with violence, but it had already pierced them with power. Defiance did not erupt in shouts or speeches. It surfaced in the smallest of gestures, a hand refusing to release a coat button, a pair of shoulders locking in place, a woman stepping back half a pace rather than forward. It was resistance measured not in force but in refusal. Not dramatic, not loud, but immovable. There are moments in captivity when a prisoner still believes they have something left to protect. For these women, that something was dignity, the last territory of the self. The camp could take freedom, could take uniform, could take food and warmth, but not yet the right to decide how much of themselves the enemy was allowed to see. Some simply stood still. Others folded their arms tightly across their chests as if bracing against a storm. A few lifted their eyes toward their captors, not in challenge but in a wordless plea that said, "I am a human being, not just a body to be examined." For the guards, hesitation was inconvenience. For the prisoners, hesitation was identity. Those in the refusal line had not coordinated a protest. They did not speak to one another or exchange plans. They were united only by instinct, the primal human response to being stripped of privacy, of modesty, of control. It was a quiet stand, but in that quietness lay its power. Inside the processing room, tension thickened. The guards expected compliance, not a battle of will. Captivity relies on predictability. If one obeys, the next will follow. But the stillness of refusal disrupted that rhythm. It was not disobedience born of pride. It was fear turned into courage. The courage to say not yet, when everything else had already said you must. One guard stepped closer to a young woman near the front of the line, barely 20, face gaunt from marching, hair tangled from wind and rain. She did not step back, but she did not move forward either. Her eyes trembled yet held firm. There was no anger in her expression, only the desperate determination of someone fighting to, protect whatever remained of herself. Another woman beside her clasped her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She whispered something under her breath, a prayer perhaps, or the name of someone she hoped to see again. Captivity can crush the body, but it cannot stop the mind from reaching outward toward dignity and memory. the two final companions of the powerless. It was then that the first consequence began to show itself. The guards, realizing compliance would not be complete, separated the refusers from the others. They were lined against the far wall, not yet punished but marked. A different kind of line, a different fate. The uncertainty was suffocating. Would they face punishment? Isolation? Forced compliance? None of them knew, only that something had now shifted inside the camp. The inspection was no longer about procedure. It had become psychological terrain, a contest of endurance before any physical force had been used. More women joined the second line, emboldened not by confidence, but by the sight of others who could not bring themselves to surrender what little control they still possessed. Silent solidarity is rarely planned. It simply appears when people recognize themselves in one another's fear. No one spoke the word resistance. No one needed to. The act itself was the statement. Far beyond the barbed wire, history would classify these moments with statistics, footnotes, and military records. But here, on this cold floor, history was written in the language of trembling hands and fixed gazes, the language of people who refused to let humiliation become routine. They were unarmed, they were exhausted, they were defeated. But in this moment, brief, fragile, and easily overlooked, they were still sovereign over at least one choice, and captivity had not yet learned how to break that. The punishment did not arrive instantly. It arrived slowly in stages, measured, methodical, and deliberate. In captivity, consequences are rarely loud. They are quiet, administrative, and precise. The goal is not to injure the body, but to erode the will. The women who refused were the last to be processed. They were not struck, not shouted at, not forced immediately into compliance. Instead, they were made to wait, standing in the cold long after others had already received camp garments and been dismissed to barracks. By the time the last compliant prisoner left the inspection room, the resistors had been standing for hours, their legs numb, their lips cracked, and their breath turning to clouds in the harsh air. Fatigue was the first instrument of discipline. The second was isolation. They were moved into a separate holding area, not a cell, but something worse, a place where they could see life continuing without them. They could hear the shuffle of footsteps, the distribution of bread, the rustle of straw mattresses inside barracks they were not allowed to enter. They remained outside the rhythm of captivity, suspended in uncertainty. For many, this was the first time they truly understood the nature of psychological punishment. Pain frightens, but uncertainty corrodes. It drains strength by forcing the mind to wander through worst-case endings without ever confirming which will come true. Some began to tremble, not from cold, but from the dawning realization that the price of refusal might only be beginning. Others clasped their hands around their sleeves, gripping fabric like a lifeline. The last physical reminder of identity before their uniforms would inevitably be stripped away. When the guards finally returned, it was not with violence, but with a choice so narrow it was hardly a choice at all. Submit, or be placed under disciplinary custody. The words were simple. The meaning was vast. Compliance meant losing dignity. Refusal meant losing everything else. A few broke at that moment, exhaustion overpowering resolve. Tears accompanied obedience, but obedience came. Others still held firm, though their faces showed the first cracks of dread. This was not heroism, it was endurance. And endurance comes with pain. The third stage of consequences was deprivation. Those who continued to resist were denied rations while others ate. Hunger, more than humiliation, wears down the instinct to protect oneself. A starving body eventually bargains with pride. The camp officials knew this. They did not need brutality, only time. By the second night, the cost had become unbearable for some. One woman fainted from cold and fatigue. Another whispered that she would comply if it meant being allowed inside, away from the wind that cut like broken glass across her skin. Others cried silently, not for rescue, but for the part of themselves they could feel slipping away. Still, a few refused, not out of defiance alone, but because surrender would feel like surrendering the last proof that they were more than what the camp intended to reduce them to. They were walking a thin line between dignity and survival, unsure which would break first. On the third morning, the message became unmistakable. What could not be taken by force would be taken by attrition. The camp no longer needed to threaten them. Hunger was doing the speaking. Cold was doing the persuasion. Isolation was doing the breaking. And through it all, each woman learned a grim truth about captivity. The punishment for refusal is not meant to make you suffer once. It is designed to make you decide to stop resisting yourself. Those who still held on were not only fighting the guards, they were fighting time. They were fighting their own human limits. And that battle, the battle inside the self, was only just beginning. Captivity does not remove identity all at once. It takes it by layers. First through fear, then through rules, and finally through ritual. The inspection was only the first tear in the seam. What followed was the systematic dismantling of who these women had been before the camp walls closed behind them. The first layer taken was uniform. To the outside world, the uniform was a symbol of ideology and allegiance, but to the women who wore it, it had become something far more personal. The last link to structure, belonging, and a life governed by order rather than humiliation. When they were forced to surrender it, they were not merely undressed. They were disconnected from the last identity they knew. Once the uniforms were seized, the camp did not refer to them as auxiliaries or nurses or clerical personnel. They were now female prisoners, a single flattened category. No ranks, no distinctions, no histories. And with the uniform went dignity's outer shell. The second layer taken was name. Roll call was no longer conducted with surnames or titles. The women were issued camp numbers, digits inked into records, sometimes stitched onto garments. Some guards memorized only the numbers, never the faces. It was easier, more efficient, and more dehumanizing that way. A number does not remember a childhood home. A number does not speak a language. A number does not have family waiting behind the front. Stripped of identity, they became interchangeable. The third layer taken was presence, the silent understanding that they no longer occupied space as individuals, but as bodies to be monitored, processed, and rationed. Meals were distributed in tin cups without acknowledgement. Commands were delivered to groups, not persons. Even illness was logged as quantity, not condition. For those who had complied during the inspection, the loss felt like slow erosion, a daily unweaving of self. For those who had resisted, it struck more violently. They could feel dignity fracturing with every hour. Resistance had cost them something precious. Compliance cost them something deeper. The barracks themselves reinforced the stripping of identity. Privacy was erased by design. Dozens slept in a single room, shoulder to shoulder on straw mats or hardboards. Even the simple act of turning away, of carving out a private moment to breathe, became nearly impossible. Captivity replaced interior life with exposure. There were no mirrors in the camp, not by accident. When a prisoner cannot see her own face, she begins to forget its familiarity. She becomes a silhouette among silhouettes, one more figure in a room of exhaustion. At night, the women lay awake, listening to the breathing of others, ragged, restless, burdened. They were reminded not of unity, but of interchangeability. In daylight, they were counted. At night, they were merely present. And yet, the hardest blow was not logistical or material. It was the psychological dislocation of becoming no one. Before the war, each woman had come from somewhere, a village, a farm, a city square, a schoolroom. They had memories of laughter, of familiarity, of being addressed by a name spoken with attachment. Now they were defined only by where they stood in line. This was the purpose of the system, to erase the idea that anything about them existed before the camp, or would survive after it. The guards could enforce obedience, the fences could enforce confinement, but the slow, invisible removal of identity, that was what enforced surrender. And in the middle of that erosion, one realization crystallized among them. When helplessness becomes routine, the mind begins to question whether the self is still worth defending, not because they wish to surrender dignity, but because captivity was teaching them to forget what dignity once felt like. The uniform had been taken, the name had been taken, But there was still one layer left, the inner world. Fragile and flickering like a candle in a room where every door was opening to a cold wind. That was the layer the camp had not yet reached. But soon, it would. Captivity changes during the day, but it transforms at night. When orders fall silent and watchtowers dim into silhouettes, the barracks become something different. Not a shelter, but a place where memory wakes. The noise of daytime humiliation fades, and in its absence, the mind retrieves the pieces of a life that still belongs to the self. That is when the whispers begin. Not loud enough to be overheard, not bold enough to be called conversation. Simply the soft murmur of women reminding one another, and themselves, that they once belonged to a world beyond fences. They whispered about home, about streets and gardens and church bells, about the shape of kitchens and the smell of harvest bread, about everyday details that war had not yet beaten out of their souls. No guard could stop that kind of speech. It was too small for discipline, too fragile for punishment, and yet it was more powerful than protest. Some whispered prayers, others whispered memories. Some simply whispered names, a mother's, a daughter's, a sister's, not to be answered, but to verify that those names still existed somewhere beyond the wire. Tragedy in captivity is never only physical. It is the slow fading of the world inside one's head. And so the women whispered as if they were stitching pieces of themselves back together in secret. Dignity, once shattered in daylight, was gathered quietly in darkness, thread by thread. The barracks became a makeshift sanctuary of silence, not freedom, but an echo of it. One night, a woman who had resisted during the inspection finally spoke. Her voice was thin, unsteady, but resolute. She did not recount her suffering. She described her village at sunrise, the way mist settled above the fields, the clatter of a wooden cart along cobblestone streets, the scent of morning earth after rain. By the time she finished, tears glimmered in more than one pair of eyes, not from sorrow but from recognition. She had reclaimed something the camp could not catalog, confiscate, or assign a number to, a personal landscape the wire could not reach. Another woman whispered a lullaby she once sang to her younger brother before the war, a song nearly buried by months of fear and exhaustion. The notes were frail at first, but then others joined softly, not to sing, but simply to breathe in harmony. In that moment, the barracks ceased to be a room of prisoners. It became a room of people remembering they were still human. The camp controlled their bodies, but memory remained their own. For a handful of hours each night, captivity loosened its grip. Not because the guards allowed mercy, but because the human spirit manufactures it in darkness when no other source remains. Whispers became the last form of resistance that cost nothing, and yet meant everything. They could no longer choose their food, their clothing, or their freedom. But they could still choose which stories they carried into tomorrow. That choice, small, fragile, and invisible, was the reason some of them survived the slow erosion of identity. In a place designed to make them feel interchangeable, the night reminded them that they were not replaceable. And as the night stretched on, a new understanding began to form among them. The body survives with rations. The spirit survives with remembrance. In daylight, they were prisoners. In darkness, they were still themselves, even if only in whispers. In every system built to dehumanize, there are cracks, small fractures where ordinary humanity slips through despite orders, despite ideology, despite war. In the camp, mercy did not arrive as a sweeping act of compassion. It appeared in fragments, brief, hesitant, almost ashamed of itself. And yet, these fragments were enough to keep some of the women from collapsing inward entirely. It often began with silence, a guard who looked away instead of shouting, allowing a woman an extra moment to gather herself before falling back into formation. A gesture so small it could not be recorded in any report, but large enough to feel like dignity preserved. There was the young guard who, when distributing rations, would tilt his ladle just a little longer over the cup of the weakest prisoner. He never spoke. He never made eye contact, but the extra sip of broth told a truth he was forbidden to voice. that war had not extinguished his ability to see suffering. Then there was the camp nurse, older than most of the others, with the stiff posture of someone long accustomed to uniforms. She did not touch the prisoners, nor comfort them openly, but she adjusted the pacing of medical checks so that those visibly trembling were not forced to strip first. She could not change the rules, only soften the edges of them. A different kind of mercy came from the camp physician, a weary man whose eyes betrayed more fatigue than cruelty. When illness swept through the barracks, he extended treatment to prisoners who were not yet considered critical, breaking protocol in quiet increments. He wrote no justification for his choices. He simply made them. These were not heroes. They were not liberators. They were cracks in the machinery of humiliation. Even a softened word could become an anchor. Even averted eyes could become protection. The women learned to recognize these sparks not as gestures of friendship, but as proof that the world outside their suffering still contained something recognizable, something human. They held on to them the way one holds a tiny ember against overwhelming cold. Mercy also appeared later, when a guard subtly loosened the harshness of a command or allowed a prisoner to tie her headscarf before roll call. Small allowances, invisible on paper, but deeply felt by those who had learned to live under constant stripping away of agency. No single act changed their condition. No one opened the gates. No one rewrote their fate. And yet, every small kindness served as a reminder. They were not erased, not entirely. For some of the women, these moments of mercy did not restore hope. They restored memory. The memory that not all enemies were cruel, that humanity could persist even across wire and uniform. In war, kindness does not rewrite violence, but it interrupts it. And in those interruptions, the prisoners glimpsed a truth rarely recorded in official histories, that even in captivity, survival is nourished by more than bread and warmth. It is nourished by recognition that someone still saw them not as bodies, not as numbers, not as trophies of defeat, but as human. It did not last long when daylight returned. Orders resumed, routines hardened, humiliation reasserted itself. But each night when the barracks fell quiet, the memories of those quiet mercies traveled with them, like embers hidden under ash, waiting for breath. And though the world outside the wire could not hear it, the faintest shift had begun inside the women themselves. They had discovered that dignity could be wounded, starved and threatened, but not fully extinguished. Not while someone, somewhere inside the system, still chose to see them as more than prisoners. Liberation did not arrive as a triumph. It did not arrive with banners or celebration or the sound of cheering. It arrived as confusion, as footsteps, unfamiliar orders, and the sudden absence of the men who once guarded the towers. One morning the women awoke to movement beyond the wire, but no one told them what had happened. Rumor traveled faster than truth. The front had shifted again. The captors were retreating. Another army was on its way. It would be hours before they realized what this meant. The gates opened, not ceremonially, not symbolically, but simply because there was no one left to close them. Many of the women did not rush forward. They stood still, uncertain, unable to trust the sight in front of them. Captivity rewires instinct. Freedom without explanation feels like a trap. Some took hesitant steps. Others remained frozen, as if a sudden step beyond the threshold might summon someone to drag them back. The body, trained by fear, does not sprint toward hope. It waits for permission it no longer needs. When they finally crossed the boundary, there was no applause. No return of identity, no warm welcome into a waiting world. The land outside the fence was not homeland. It was simply elsewhere. They were no longer guarded, but they were not yet restored. In the eyes of the world, liberation should have marked an ending. For the women, it marked the beginning of a different kind of endurance. Life after humiliation. Their uniforms were gone. Their names were numbers in foreign ledgers. Their dignity had been weathered into silence. Some walked away in groups, bound not by loyalty but by shared depletion. Others drifted alone, as though uncertain where a self could be found again after so much had been stripped away. The body may be released first. The mind follows much later and not always fully. On the road home, a new fear replaced the old. Who would they be once they returned? Those who had families did not know if they were still alive. Those who had once carried rank or purpose no longer recognized themselves as anything more than survivors. Some felt unworthy of sympathy, others feared they would receive none. Liberation offers escape, but not restoration. There were no counselors, no officials guiding them toward recovery, no recognition of what they endured. History, especially in the aftermath of war, is often written in terms of territory gained or lost, not of dignity lost and never returned. Official documents noted their release. No file recorded the erasure of identity, the hunger, the humiliation, or the inner wounds invisible to the eye. For many, freedom felt like stepping into a world that had moved on without them, a world eager to forget the war, and everything it had done to those trapped on the losing end of it. Some carried shame for things they never chose. Some carried silence because no one wanted to hear. Some carried memories so heavy they spoke of them only decades later. If at all, the wire had opened, but the captivity of the spirit lingered. It would live on in the way they avoided mirrors, in the way they flinched at sudden commands, in the way they guarded their bodies long after no one threatened them. Freedom, as the world understood it, meant the absence of guards. But for these women, freedom meant learning, slowly, painfully, how to become human again after being treated as less than one. Their story did not end at the gate. It followed them home, and it would remain with them long after history closed its chapter on the war. History often records wars as a contest of weapons, decisions, and territory. But for the women who refused to surrender their dignity in captivity, the true battlefield was interior, a struggle not of armies, but of identity. Their refusal was not immortalized in medals or monuments. It was not written into military dispatches or etched onto memorial plaques. It lived instead in silence, in trauma carried inward, in the private cost of choosing humiliation over compliance, or compliance over self. When the years passed and the front lines faded into textbooks, their story was not told. They returned to a world that expected stillness, propriety, and forgetting. Society wanted uniforms folded away, not explained. It wanted endings, not wounds. It wanted closure. But emotional captivity does not end when the gates unlock. The price of refusal followed them through the rest of their lives. For some, it was carried in the body, the toll of hunger and untreated illness, the scars of deprivation that outlasted winter. For others, it lived in behavior, the instinctive flinch when a voice grew sharp, the panic born from the memory of being watched with no power to shield oneself. And for many, the deepest wound was invisibility. They were not remembered as women who endured, resisted, protected their sense of self in the only way left available. They were remembered, if at all, simply as prisoners. But history rarely pauses to ask what it costs a person to keep even a fragment of dignity when everything else has been taken. Their refusal was not dramatic. It was quiet. It was trembling. It was born not of pride, but of protection, the desperate preservation of the last boundary that made them human. Some historians would later argue that they could have complied sooner, or that the inspection was merely procedure. Such analysis flattens the truth. Procedure is clinical. Humiliation is personal. These women were not resisting rules. They were resisting erasure. The camp tried to break them by withholding warmth, comfort, and belonging. What it could never fully take was the knowledge that for a moment, even a moment, they drew a line and stood upon it. A small defiance, but a costly one. Liberation freed their bodies. Refusal cost them peace. In the decades that followed, very few of them spoke of what happened, not because they wished to forget, but because they knew no one wanted to listen. The world prefers clean endings, not the complicated survival of human dignity, and so their courage existed mostly in silence, preserved not in records but in private memory. Today, their story is not a tale of victory or defeat, but of the human spirit enduring under circumstances designed to strip it. They were not heroes in the way war stories define heroism. They were not soldiers on a battlefield. They were women standing against the quiet machinery of dehumanization, using the only weapon they still possessed, refusal. In the end, the greatest act of resistance was not rebellion, it was remembrance of self, and the price they paid was to carry that remembrance alone.